Okay, History 259. This is part 2 of 2. I had a tech problem, so this week's video lecture will be in 2 parts. So I'll make that clear in the email that I send you, but I was very rudely interrupted right in the middle of making an important point about slavery and the Constitution, so let me continue to make that point. So again, sorry about the tech problems, but this snippet of video will be quite short because I was getting near the end of the video when I was rudely interrupted. So I was saying at the very end of part 1 of 2, the first video of this that you'll watch, that we don't see the words slave and slavery appear at all in the Constitution. As Alan Taylor says on page 381, quote, in the Constitution, the delegates adopted euphemisms to avoid the terms slave and slavery, referring instead to other persons or such persons as the states now existing shall think proper to admit, and any person bound to service or labor. So euphemisms using different ways to express not to express, but using different words to refer to slaves and slavery. That's important to keep in mind. And why did they do this? Well, as Alan Taylor notes later on in that paragraph, that the delegates to the Constitutional Convention, even slaveholders, but also including non-slaveholders, felt that including those words would be to stain the Constitution, morally stain the Constitution. So they used instead moral evasion, which is a point that's made in page 381, right? That we can't put those words in the Constitution because it will project to the world a moral failing on our part to incorporate this institution into the Constitution, but yet we'll continue to talk about it just in different terms, right? These euphemisms that Alan Taylor points out. And so there are 3 sections of the Constitution, remembering that we can't find the word slave and slavery where we do see slavery appear. And the first is Article 1, Section 2. And if you're looking at the link I posted on Blackboard for the Constitution, it's at the very beginning, and it's the first highlighted portion, beginning with representatives and direct taxes. And that is, this section is what today we call the 3/5 clause, which has to do with representation in the houses of Congress. It says representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states of this union according to their respective numbers, aka their population, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including indentured servants, 3/5 of all other persons. So the way to translate that is that we will take the whole number of free people, meaning white residents of each state, including those who are indentured servants, contracted servants for a temporary period of time. These will all count as free people for the purpose of determining the state's population. And then we will take 3/5 of all other persons, meaning we'll count 60% of the slave population for the purpose of determining the state's population and therefore representation. So sometimes this is expressed as saying that the Constitution recognizes slaves as 3/5 of one person. What they really meant by it is we're going to count 60% of the slave population. At the Constitutional Convention, slaveholders, but especially slaveholders from the southernmost states of South Carolina and Georgia, consistently argued that they wanted slaves to count equal to one free person. Whereas some delegates, especially from Pennsylvania and New England, argued that slaves shouldn't count at all. Why? Because state laws where slavery was legal did not recognize slaves as persons. Why should the Constitution recognize slaves as persons for the purpose of determining the state's population? It's not fair for a state like South Carolina to legally categorize slaves not as people, but the Constitution view them as people so that those slave states would have more representatives. So this is the major debate. And how was 3/5 agreed upon? Well, as a part of a compromise. One that was extensive in terms of the length of the debate that I don't have enough time to go into, but still, I think most importantly, we can view this as a victory for slaveholders. Slaveholders, especially in the 30 years after the Constitution was ratified for the next 3 decades, had a built-in numerical advantage. They were disproportionately represented, slaveholders disproportionately represented in the United States Congress, given their actual numbers. So that's the first part, Article 1, Section 2, aka the 3/5 clause. The second area and the main question that I talked about at the beginning is Article 1, Section 9. So if you scroll down, if you stay in Article 1, Section 2, the 3/5 clause, if you scroll down to Section 9, which is about halfway down this webpage, Section 9, I want to talk about the very first clause, so the first text immediately after the beginning of Section 9. This is called the Slave Trade Clause, having to do with the slave trade. So as I mentioned, a major question: should the slave trade be allowed by this new government, or should it not be? And we read the text, and then we'll break it down. The migration or importation of such persons as any of the, there it is, such persons, aka slaves, right? The migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit, shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808, but a tax or duty may be imposed upon such importation not exceeding $10 for each person. Okay, what does that mean? Well, first of all, we see these euphemisms, such persons. Okay, everybody knew this referred to slaves, but according to the actual text, it's such person. So what that says is that Congress cannot prevent slaves from being imported into the United States for 20 years until the year 1808. But in that 20-year period, it could pass a slave trade tax, $10 for each slave. So that's very open-ended. It doesn't say what would happen after 20 years. It just says for the next 20 years, Congress cannot abolish the slave trade. It can place a tax, but it doesn't have to. So this is very much a product of compromise. As Alan Taylor notes on page 380 of American Revolutions, this was a section of the Constitution which was created through negotiations with lower South slaveholders, especially delegates from Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and some members of the New England delegation who wanted, as he says on page 380, the Constitution, quote, to empower Congress to pass navigation acts by a mere majority rather than 2/3. So the trade-off is that Southerners secured the ability to import slaves for 20 years, while New Englanders received favorable trade provisions in the Constitution. So this was a deal that was made, and the result, this very vague and awkwardly worded Article 1, Section 9. Now, as we'll see moving forward, what did ultimately happen is that the slave trade was abolished in 20 years in 1808 while Thomas Jefferson was president. And we'll talk more about that when we get to it. The final section where we see slavery incorporated into the Constitution is Article 4, so you need to scroll down to the very end, Section 2. And this 2 is a blue highlighted section. This section, when you scroll down, you can see there's a hyperlink, is called the Fugitive Slave Clause. Slaveholders in the Constitutional Convention, yes, demanded that the national government give them an explicit constitutional right to recover fugitive slaves who ran away from one state into another state, meaning when slaves run away and they cross boundaries from state to state, that becomes an area of national authority. So slaveholders demanded that the national government allow them to recover such slaves. And that is included here, Article 4, again, Section 2. No person held to service or labor, meaning slave, right? Another euphemism, in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such labor or service may be due. Translation: slaveholders have a constitutional right to recover fugitive slaves. Just because a slave runs away from a slave state to a free state does not mean they're free. So this is, again, called the Fugitive Slave Clause. So these are the three areas of the Constitution where we see slavery explicitly included. And just to wrap this up in video 2 of 2, because I was so rudely interrupted, pisses me off. The takeaway that we should get from this discussion of the Constitution is that this blueprint provided for a stronger national government, but never forgetting the fact that this was a blueprint that was created by elites, primarily to protect elite interests. And secondly, when we look at the interests of elite slaveholders, we see that the Constitution provides some protections, the just mentioned Fugitive Slave Clause. The Constitution does not allow the national government to interfere with slavery where it already existed. Again, the federal consensus. The Constitution did allow the slave trade to continue for 20 years. And yet, ultimately, the Constitution, and this is true moving forward in subsequent generations, was ambiguous. We don't see the words slave and slavery appear in the Constitution. So it's the product of an ambiguous compromise. And that's the point that I would leave you with today. So again, thank you for listening. This is video 2 of 2. I will make that clear in the links that I give you. And I will see you all next week. As I said at the outset, I'm going to post a discussion board response today, Wednesday, and you'll have until Sunday, the end of the weekend, to finish it. And you'll also be getting both your second paper grades and your final paper prompt back this week as well. So get in touch with me if you have any questions, and otherwise try to be safe, and I'll see you through video next week. All right, thanks.